The morning fog rolled across the Belgian countryside like a ghost, unwilling to leave, clinging to the earth with cold, desperate fingers. It was December 1944, and the world had learned to measure time not in hours, but in heartbeats. The space between incoming artillery shells, the pause before a machine gun opened fire, the terrible silence that followed a tank's track grinding to a halt. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Corporal James "Jimmy" Dalton sat in the gunner's seat of his M4 Sherman tank, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air inside the steel coffin they called home. The interior smelled of gun oil, sweat, and the metallic tang of spent shell casings that rolled across the floor with every movement of the 30-ton machine. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the traverse wheel, not from fear, though fear was always there, a constant companion, but from the cold that seeped through every rivet and seam. "Contact front," came the voice of Lieutenant Marcus Holbrook through the intercom, crackling with static and urgency. "Tiger tank, 800 yards, hull down behind that farmhouse." Jimmy's heart didn't race. It stopped. For one terrible, infinite moment, it simply ceased to beat, and in that silence, he could hear every terrible story he'd ever been told about the German Tiger I. The tank that could kill them from a mile away. The tank whose frontal armor, their 75mm shells bounced off like pebbles against a castle wall. The tank that had turned entire platoons of Shermans into burning wrecks scattered across the winter landscape like discarded toys. "Jimmy, you hear me?" Holbrook's voice cut through the paralysis. "Yeah, LT, I hear you." Jimmy's voice was steadier than he felt. His hands found their positions on the controls, left hand on the elevation wheel, right on the firing trigger. Automatic, practiced, the muscle memory of 1,000 training exercises and too many real engagements. Behind him, in the loader's position, Private Eddie Kowalski was already moving, his young face set in concentration as he prepared the next shell. Eddie was 19. Fresh-faced despite 3 months in the European theater, with a photograph of a girl named Mary tucked inside his helmet. He'd shown it to Jimmy a dozen times, talking about the wedding they'd have after the war, the house they'd buy, the children they'd name. "AP roundup," Eddie announced, his voice tight but controlled. In the driver's seat, Sergeant Tom Hawkins had already begun backing their Sherman into a slight depression in the terrain, using every inch of available cover. Hawk was 32, ancient by tank crew standards, a man who'd survived North Africa and Sicily through a combination of skill, instinct, and the kind of luck that couldn't possibly last forever. He had a wife and 2 daughters waiting in Kansas, and he wore their names carved into a piece of shell casing on a chain around his neck. The bow gunner specialist Ray Chen was the quietest of them all. He'd been a music teacher in San Francisco before the war, played piano in a way that made grown men weep. Now his fingers rested on the triggers of the .30 caliber bow machine gun, and the only music he made was the staccato rhythm of gunfire. "LT," Jimmy said slowly, an idea crystallizing in his mind that was either brilliant or insane, probably both. "I need you to trust me on something crazy." Holbrook was silent for 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. The Tiger's turret was beginning to traverse, its massive guns swinging toward them with terrible mechanical precision. "How crazy we talking, Jimmy? Remember that night in the barn outside Bastogne, when I was talking about convergence points and ballistic arcs? The night Hawk told you to shut up and let him sleep? That's the one." Jimmy's hands were already moving, adjusting the elevation wheel with minute precision. "I think I can do it, sir, but I need you to hold position. Can't be backing up, can't be moving forward, perfectly still." "That thing gets its gun on us while we're sitting still. We're dead," Hawk growled from the driver's seat. "We're dead anyway if we try to run. That 88 will punch through our rear armor like it's paper. At least give me one shot." The Tiger's gun was almost on them now. Jimmy could see it through his periscope, that long, deadly tube that had ended so many American tank crews. He could imagine the German gunner on the other end, probably confident, probably relaxed. Another easy kill, another Tommy cooker. That's what the Germans called Shermans. They burned so easily. "Do it," Holbrook said quietly. Jimmy took a breath that tasted of oil and fear and cold metal. His theory was simple in concept, impossible in execution. The M4 Sherman 75mm gun was designed to fire in a relatively flat trajectory at typical combat ranges. But what if you didn't fire flat? What if you aimed high, much higher than standard doctrine allowed, and used gravity itself as a weapon? The physics were straightforward. A shell fired at a high angle would arc through the air, spending more time in flight, losing some of its kinetic energy, but gaining potential energy from the height. When it fell, it would strike at a steep angle. And here was the crucial part. The Tiger's armor, formidable as it was designed to deflect shots coming in at shallow angles. The top armor of the turret, the engine deck, those were the weak points. Thinner, less angled, vulnerable. But hitting a target 700 yards away with a trajectory that arced 30 or 40 feet in the air, with a gun that wasn't designed for indirect fire, with no spotter, no ranging shots, no time to adjust? It was mathematically possible. Jimmy had worked out the calculations in his head, scratched them in the dirt, tested them against distances and heights whenever they had a spare moment. But possible and probable were two very different things. "Range, 750, he muttered to himself, his hand on the elevation wheel. "Target, stationary. Wind, minimal. Temperature, cold. Air, dense. Adjust for—" "Jimmy, he's got us!" Ray Chen's voice cut through, tight with suppressed panic. The Tiger's gun was locked on them now. Jimmy could see the dark circle of the muzzle, could imagine the German gunner on the other end, probably confident, probably relaxed. Another easy kill, another Tommy cooker. That's what the Germans called Shermans. They burned so easily. "Do it," Holbrook said quietly. Jimmy took a breath that tasted of oil and fear and cold metal. His theory was simple in concept, impossible in execution. The M4 Sherman 75mm gun was designed to fire in a relatively flat trajectory at typical combat ranges. But what if you didn't fire flat? What if you aimed high, much higher than standard doctrine allowed, and used gravity itself as a weapon? The physics were straightforward. A shell fired at a high angle would arc through the air, spending more time in flight, losing some of its kinetic energy, but gaining potential energy from the height. When it fell, it would strike at a steep angle. And here was the crucial part. The Tiger's armor, formidable as it was designed to deflect shots coming in at shallow angles. The top armor of the turret, the engine deck, those were the weak points. Thinner, less angled, vulnerable. But hitting a target 700 yards away with a trajectory that arced 30 or 40 feet in the air, with a gun that wasn't designed for indirect fire, with no spotter, no ranging shots, no time to adjust? It was mathematically possible. Jimmy had worked out the calculations in his head, scratched them in the dirt, tested them against distances and heights whenever they had a spare moment. But possible and probable were two very different things. Jimmy watched through his periscope as the shell climbed into the gray morning sky, a dark streak against the fog. For a moment, it seemed to hang there, suspended, and Jimmy had the terrible certainty that he'd miscalculated, that the shell would fall short or wide, that the German gunner was already firing, that in 2 seconds they'd all be— The shell plunged downward and struck the Tiger's engine deck with a sound like the hammer of God. For one frozen instant, nothing happened. The Tiger sat there, seemingly unaffected, and Jimmy felt his heart sink into his boots. A dud. Or the armor had held. Or— Then the engine deck erupted in a gout of flame and black smoke. The Tiger's turret hatch flew open, and crew members began tumbling out, their uniforms smoking. The massive tank sat there, mortally wounded, fire beginning to spread from its engine compartment as ammunition cooked off inside with muffled bangs. Inside the Sherman, there was absolute silence. "Holy Mother of God," Eddie Kowalski whispered. "Did you just—" Hawk started, then stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "He just killed a tiger," Ray Chen said, his voice full of something between awe and disbelief. "With a Sherman, frontally." Holbrook's voice came through the intercom, and Jimmy could hear the shake in it. "Jimmy, what the hell did you just do?" Jimmy sat back in his gunner's seat, his hands trembling now, the adrenaline that had kept them steady finally flooding his system. "Indirect fire, sir. High-angle shot. Hit the top armor instead of the frontal plate." That's not doctrine. That's not in any manual I've ever read." "No, sir, it's not." Holbrook was quiet for a moment. In the distance, the Tiger continued to burn, its crew scattered in the field around it, and Jimmy felt a complicated mixture of emotions. Relief that he was alive, satisfaction at proving his theory, and guilt, always guilt, at the men on the other side who would never go home, never see their own families, their own Marys waiting with photographs. "Can you do it again?" Holbrook finally asked. Jimmy looked at his hands, looked at the traverse wheel and the elevation controls that he'd spent so many nights studying, so many hours practicing with, thought about all the other Tigers out there, all the other German tanks that outgunned and out-armored them, thought about all the other American crews who died because the Sherman simply couldn't win a straight fight. "Yes, sir. I think I can." But what Jimmy couldn't know, what none of them could know as they sat there in their steel box, still alive against all odds, was that this single shot would change everything. That word would spread through the battalion, then the regiment, then the division. That within weeks, other gunners would be trying to replicate his technique. That some would succeed and some would fail, but all of them would be trying. That by the spring of 1945, the unofficial manual of tricks that tank crews passed between themselves would include Dalton's drop shot as a viable, if extremely difficult tactic against heavy German armor. And Jimmy couldn't know that 3 days later, a young lieutenant named Garrison would try the same shot and take out a Panther, or that a week after that, a grizzled sergeant named O'Brien would use it to kill a Tiger II, the King Tiger, even more formidable than the Tiger they'd just destroyed, or that by the end of the war, at least 17 confirmed German heavy tank kills would be attributed to variations of the technique he'd just invented out of desperation and physics and too many sleepless nights. But all of that was in the future. Right now, in this moment, there was only the burning Tiger and the 5 men in a Sherman who had just learned that sometimes the impossible was just the difficult wearing a different face.
"Driver, reverse us another 50 yards, Holbrook ordered. "Stay in cover. Loader, keep those AP rounds coming. Gunner—" He paused. "Good shooting, Jimmy. Real good shooting." Jimmy nodded. Though Holbrook couldn't see him, his hands found their places on the controls again, muscle memory and training taking over. Because there was still a war to fight. Still more German armor out there in the fog. Still more impossible odds to somehow overcome. But for the first time in a long time, Jimmy Dalton thought they might actually have a chance. The first time Jimmy Dalton had seen a tank, he'd been 8 years old, watching a newsreel at the Paramount Theater in his hometown of Millbrook, Pennsylvania. It was 1932, and the grainy black and white footage showed British tanks rumbling across some desert, their tracks churning up sand, their guns pointing toward an unseen enemy. His father, sitting beside him in the dark theater, had leaned over and whispered, "Those are the future of war, son. Cavalry used to charge on horses. Now they charge in steel." Jimmy had been mesmerized, not by the violence or the martial glory, but by the machinery itself, by the physics of it, how something so heavy could move, how the weight was distributed across those tracks, how the suspension absorbed the shock of rough terrain. Even then, young and small and wearing hand-me-down shoes with cardboard stuffed in the soles to cover the holes, Jimmy had seen the world in terms of angles and forces, trajectories and velocities. His mother used to say he'd been born asking why and never stopped. Why did balls fall in curves when you threw them? Why did some things float and others sink? Why did the creek behind their house flow faster around the outside of a bend than the inside? His father, a machinist at the steel mill before it closed, encouraged this curiosity, bringing home broken tools and machine parts for Jimmy to disassemble and study. But when the mill shut down in 1936, everything changed. His father found work where he could, odd jobs, repair work, sometimes traveling for weeks to find employment. His mother took in sewing, her fingers working by lamplight late into the night, her eyes growing tired and strained. Jimmy, 13 years old, started delivering newspapers before school and working at Morrison's grocery store after, sweeping floors and stacking shelves. He'd still found time for his calculations, though, still spent his free moments with a stub of pencil and whatever paper he could scavenge, working out problems that existed only in his mind. If you dropped a ball from the top of the church steeple, how long would it take to hit the ground? If you threw it instead, at what angle would it travel the farthest? His teachers at Millbrook High School noticed his aptitude for mathematics and physics, encouraged him to apply for college scholarships. But then it was 1941, and the world exploded into war, and suddenly scholarships seemed like luxuries from a different lifetime. Jimmy enlisted in January 1942, 3 weeks after his 18th birthday. His mother had cried, holding him at the bus station with a grip that trembled, her thin frame shaking against his chest. His father had shaken his hand, man to man, and said only, "Come home, Jimmy. Whatever else happens, you come home." He'd wanted to promise. But they both knew such promises were made of air and hope, and neither was bulletproof. Basic training at Fort Knox had been a revelation. For the first time in years, Jimmy had 3 meals a day. For the first time ever, he had access to instructors who understood physics, who could discuss ballistics and trajectories and the mathematics of violence. The Army needed tankers, and tankers needed to understand their weapons, and Jimmy soaked up every piece of knowledge like parched ground absorbing rain. His bunkmate during basic was a kid from Chicago named Frankie Delano, whose family ran a restaurant in Little Italy. Frankie talked constantly about food, about girls, about the Cubs and whether they'd ever win a World Series, about everything and nothing. At night when the barracks finally fell silent, except for snoring and the occasional nightmare-induced cry, Frankie would whisper across the space between our bunks, "You really think we can beat them, Jimmy? The Germans?" Jimmy would stare at the ceiling, at the cracks in the plaster that looked like maps of countries that didn't exist. "Physics doesn't care about politics, Frankie. Their tanks follow the same laws of motion ours do. Their armor obeys the same principles of force and resistance. It's just a math problem." "Yeah, but their math is bigger than ours. Tigers, panthers, those things are monsters."
"Monsters bleed," Jimmy would say, though he wasn't sure he believed it. Not yet. Not until that morning in Belgium, when belief became empirical fact, demonstrated with 15 pounds of steel and explosive. But that morning was still years away. First came more training, then the convoy across the Atlantic in the spring of 1943, crammed into the hold of a Liberty ship with hundreds of other men, breathing recycled air and trying not to think about German U-boats. Then England, where they trained some more, running their Shermans across the muddy countryside, learning to work as a crew, learning to trust each other with their lives. That's where he met Marcus Holbrook, fresh from OCS, 23 years old, and trying to project confidence he probably didn't feel. Holbrook was from Virginia, spoke with a soft drawl that never got louder, even when he was giving orders under fire.
He had a degree in literature from the University of Virginia, could quote Hemingway and Faulkner from memory, and approached tank warfare like it was a problem in literary analysis, looking for themes, patterns, character development. "The Germans fight like they're writing tragedies," Holbrook had said one evening as they maintained their Sherman, oiled in grease under their fingernails. "Big, dramatic, overwhelming force. We need to fight like we're writing detective novels, clever, using what we have creatively, finding the clues others miss." Jimmy had liked that metaphor, liked Holbrook's way of thinking about warfare as something other than simple mathematics or brute force. And as their crew came together, Hawk with his quiet competence, Eddie with his earnest optimism, Ray with his thoughtful silences, Jimmy began to understand that survival wasn't just about physics. It was about people, about trust. They landed in Normandy on D+7, a week after the initial invasion, rolling their Sherman off an LST onto Omaha Beach. The sand was still churned up from the fighting, and if you looked close, you could see things you didn't want to see half buried in the disturbed earth. They didn't look close. The fighting through the hedgerows of Normandy was brutal, claustrophobic. The Sherman was a good tank in open country, but the bocage turned every field into a potential ambush site. German anti-tank guns would wait behind the thick hedgerows, invisible until they fired, and by then it was often too late. Jimmy learned to fight in short, sharp engagements, the kind where reaction time mattered more than clever tactics. He killed his first enemy tank, a Panzer IV, outside Saint-Lô in July. The German tank had appeared from behind a farm building, its gun already traversing toward them, and Jimmy had fired on instinct. No time for calculations or clever shots. The AP round punched through the Panzer's thinner side armor, and Jimmy had watched the crew bail out, stumbling away from their burning vehicle with their uniforms smoking. That night he couldn't eat, sat beside their Sherman with his mess kit untouched, while the others talked quietly among themselves. Holbrook came and sat beside him, not saying anything at first, just being present. "They would have killed us," Jimmy finally said. "If I'd been a second slower, we'd be dead." "I know. So, why do I feel like this?" Holbrook was quiet for a long moment. "Because you're human. The day you stop feeling it is the day you should worry." But the feeling had faded, as feelings do when repeated exposure dulls their edge. By August, Jimmy had stopped counting. By September, as they pushed through Belgium, he'd stopped remembering their faces. It was necessary. The alternative was paralysis, and paralysis got you killed. The first time they encountered a tiger was outside Aachen in October. They'd been advancing down a street already half destroyed by artillery, buildings on either side reduced to facades with empty windows like skull sockets. The tiger had appeared at an intersection 300 yards ahead, its massive bulk seeming to fill the entire street, its 88mm gun pointed directly at them. Holbrook had screamed for Hawk to reverse, and the driver had thrown their Sherman into gear, backing up as fast as the transmission would allow. But they weren't fast enough. The tiger fired once, and the shell, Jimmy saw it, actually saw it, a dark streak in the air, passed so close to their turret that he felt the displacement of air, heard the crack of its passage. It missed by inches. The tiger's second shot wasn't aimed at them. It struck Lieutenant Morrison's Sherman 200 yards to their left, and the result was catastrophic. Morrison's tank didn't just burn, it exploded, ammunition cooking off in a chain reaction that sent the turret 20 feet into the air. Nobody got out. They'd survived that encounter by running, by using the ruins of buildings for cover, by getting the hell out of the tiger's firing lane and calling for air support that took 30 minutes to arrive. But those 30 minutes, huddled behind a collapsed warehouse while the tiger prowled the streets like a mechanical predator, had changed something in Jimmy. He'd started working on the problem that very night. The physics were complex, but not impossible. A standard 75mm AP round left the Sherman's gun at approximately 2,030 feet per second. At a flat trajectory, it lost velocity over distance due to air resistance, following a predictable ballistic curve. Against a tiger's 100mm frontal armor angled at 9 degrees from vertical, the round simply didn't have enough kinetic energy to penetrate beyond about 300 yards, and even that was optimistic. But what if you changed the variables? Jimmy had spent his evenings working through the calculations, using the back of ration boxes, the margins of field manuals, anything he could write on. Hawk had teased him about it, called him Professor, but Jimmy could see the older sergeant watching sometimes, curious despite himself. The breakthrough came in November, during a 3-day lull in the fighting while they waited for fuel supplies to catch up. Jimmy had been thinking about mortars, how they fired at high angles, lobbing shells in an arc to clear obstacles and strike targets behind cover. The principle was simple: trade some kinetic energy for potential energy by sending the projectile high, then let gravity add velocity as it fell. But could it work with a tank gun? Tank guns were designed for direct fire, not indirect. The sights weren't calibrated for high-angle shots. The gun elevation was limited, and hitting a moving target with an arcing shot would be nearly impossible. The shell's flight time would be too long, giving the target time to move. But what if you changed the variables? Jimmy had spent his evenings working through the calculations, using the back of ration boxes, the margins of field manuals, anything he could write on. Hawk had teased him about it, called him Professor, but Jimmy could see the older sergeant watching sometimes, curious despite himself. The breakthrough came in November, during a 3-day lull in the fighting while they waited for fuel supplies to catch up. Jimmy had been thinking about mortars, how they fired at high angles, lobbing shells in an arc to clear obstacles and strike targets behind cover. The principle was simple: trade some kinetic energy for potential energy by sending the projectile high, then let gravity add velocity as it fell. But could it work with a tank gun? Tank guns were designed for direct fire, not indirect. The sights weren't calibrated for high-angle shots. The gun elevation was limited, and hitting a moving target with an arcing shot would be nearly impossible. The shell's flight time would be too long, giving the target time to move. But if the target was stationary? Jimmy had run the numbers again and again. A 75mm shell fired at an elevation of 23 degrees, just within the Sherman's maximum gun elevation, would arc to a height of approximately 40 feet at a range of 700 yards. When it fell, it would be traveling at a steep enough angle to potentially strike the thinner top armor of a German heavy tank. The engine deck on a Tiger was only 25mm thick. The turret top was 40mm. Both were vulnerable to a 75mm AP round striking from above. The problem was accuracy. Wind, temperature, the exact angle of elevation, the precise range to target, all of these variables mattered enormously at such an arc. A small error in any calculation would send the shell wide or short, and you wouldn't get ranging shots. The first round had to count, because the moment you fired and missed, the enemy tank would know where you were and would return fire with devastating accuracy. Jimmy had shared his theory with Holbrook one evening as they sat in a barn outside Bastogne. The 5 crew members huddled around a small fire made from broken furniture. He'd drawn diagrams in the dirt, explained the physics, walked through the calculations. Hawk had snorted. "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Trying to hit a tank by dropping a shell on it from 40 feet up? Might as well be throwing stones." "The physics work," Jimmy insisted. "It's just a matter of being lucky enough to hit a target the size of a barn door from nearly half a mile away, with a shot that spends 3 seconds in the air, accounting for wind and temperature and about 50 other variables you can't possibly calculate in combat." Hawk shook his head. "Stick to the doctrine, kid. Flanking shots, weak spots, combined arms. That's what works." "Doctrine gets us killed when we face tigers head-on," Jimmy shot back. "So does sitting still long enough to line up some miracle shot while they pound us into scrap." They'd gone back and forth, voices rising, until Holbrook had cut them off. "Enough. Jimmy, keep working on it. Hawk, keep us alive with what we know works. We might need both before this is over." And now, 3 weeks later, standing beside their Sherman as the December sun struggled to burn through the morning fog, Jimmy realized that "before this is over" had arrived sooner than any of them expected. Other crews were gathering around them, drawn by the sight of the burning Tiger in the distance, by the impossible fact of its destruction. Word had spread with the speed of rumor, always faster than official communications, that Dalton's crew had killed a tiger, frontally, at 700 yards. Captain Pierce, their company commander, arrived in his own Sherman, dismounting with the stiff movements of a man who'd been sitting in a tank for too many hours. He was 42, old for a combat command, with gray at his temples and a face that seemed carved from granite by too many hard decisions. "Lieutenant Holbrook," he said, returning the younger officer's salute, "I hear your gunner just did something impossible." "Yes, sir." Holbrook gestured to Jimmy. "Corporal Dalton, sir. He's been working on the technique for weeks." Pierce turned his attention to Jimmy, his gray eyes sharp and assessing. "Explain it to me, Corporal. Slowly. Assume I barely passed high school physics." So Jimmy explained it again, drawing diagrams in the frost-covered earth, walking through the mathematics of trajectories and impact angles. Other gunners gathered around, listening intently, asking questions. Some looked skeptical. Others looked hungry, like men who'd been offered a weapon they desperately needed. "Can you teach it?" Pierce asked when Jimmy finished. I may be, sir, but it's not easy. The shot has to be perfect. Range estimation, angle calculation, target has to be stationary or moving very slowly. And you only get one chance. Miss, and they know exactly where you are. But it works. It worked once, sir, against one tiger, in specific conditions. Pierce nodded slowly, looking out toward the still-burning German tank. "Once is more than we had yesterday. I want you to teach your technique to every gunner in the company. We'll set up practice ranges when we can, but for now, do it as you have time. Share everything you know." "Sir, I'm not an instructor. You're a corporal who just killed a tiger with a Sherman. That makes you the most qualified instructor we have. Make it happen, Dalton." "Yes, sir." As Pierce walked away, Jimmy felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Ray Chen, the quiet bow gunner who rarely spoke unless he had something important to say. "You know what you've done?" Ray asked softly. "You've given them hope. Every man here who's faced a tiger and run, who's watched friends die because we couldn't fight back effectively, you've shown them it's possible. That's worth more than you know." But Jimmy wasn't sure it was hope he'd given them. It might just be false confidence, the kind that got people killed. Because what worked once, under perfect conditions, might not work again. Might not work in rain or snow or heavy wind. Might not work when the enemy was moving, when your own tank was moving, when artillery was falling and infantry was screaming, and the whole world was chaos and fire. And Jimmy couldn't shake the feeling that he just made himself responsible for all of it, for every gunner who would try his technique and fail, for every crew that would die trying to replicate his one moment of calculated luck. Eddie Kowalski seemed to sense his disquiet. The young loader came up beside him, grinning his easy grin, the one that seemed impossible to break no matter what horrors they witnessed. "Hey, Jimmy, you know what this means, right? That I'm an idiot who got lucky? Nah, man. It means you're a hero. It means we get home, you'll have stories to tell. It means married friends will want to meet you at the wedding. If we get home, Eddie. When, Jimmy, when we get home." Eddie's optimism was relentless, aggressive, almost weaponized. "You can't think about the if. You'll go crazy. You gotta believe in the when." Maybe Eddie was right. Maybe that's how you survived. Not by calculating odds or thinking through worst-case scenarios, but by simply deciding that you would make it, that the universe would bend to accommodate your survival because the alternative was unthinkable. Jimmy wished he could think that way, but his mind didn't work like that. It worked in probabilities and physics, in cold equations that didn't care about hope or belief. And those equations told him that survival in a Sherman, even with his new technique, was still mostly luck. Better luck than before, maybe, but luck nonetheless. That night, as they loggered in a frozen field with the rest of their company,
Jimmy tried to sleep but couldn't. Lay in his bedroll beneath the Sherman's bulk, staring up at the tank's steel belly and thinking about physics. About all the forces in the world that wanted to tear through that steel and end them. About all the variables he couldn't control. Hawk, lying a few feet away, spoke into the darkness. "You still awake, Professor?" "Yeah. That shot today, that was something. Really something. Just physics, Hawk. Nothing magical about it." "Maybe, but you know what? Sometimes physics looks a lot like magic to those of us who barely understand it." The older sergeant was quiet for a moment. "My girls, Jimmy, back home. They're 8 and 10 now, growing up without the dad around. And I know the odds. I know most of us don't make it through. But today, because of you, those odds got a little better. That's not nothing." Jimmy felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. "Get home to them, Hawk. Whatever it takes." "That's the plan. You too. You got people waiting?" "My parents. My mom writes every week. Dad's working in the factory now, making shell casings. He always ends his letters the same way. Do the math, son. Come home." "Smart man. The math says we've got better odds as of this morning." Maybe that was true. Or maybe the math said they'd just gotten lucky once, and luck was a finite resource that ran out when you least expected it. But Jimmy didn't say that. Instead, he closed his eyes and tried to sleep. Tried to silence the part of his mind that was already calculating the next impossible shot. The war ended on a Tuesday in May 1945, and Jimmy Dalton was still alive. So were Hark, Ray, Eddie, and Lieutenant Holbrook. Against every statistical probability, against the cold mathematics of attrition that said tank crews in the European theater had a life expectancy measured in weeks, all 5 of them had made it through. Their Sherman, the same one they'd climbed into on the beaches of Normandy, sat silent now in a German field, its gun finally cold, its engine mercifully quiet.
Became experts. Others never quite got the feel for it. But the technique had claimed at least 17 confirmed German heavy tank kills, each one representing a Sherman crew that lived when they might have died. Captain Pierce had put Jimmy in for a Silver Star. The paperwork was somewhere in the vast machinery of military bureaucracy, and Jimmy didn't particularly care if it ever surfaced. The medal that mattered was simpler. 5 men going home instead of being buried in foreign soil. On the transport ship back to New York, Hawk had shown Jimmy a letter from his wife. His daughters had grown. The youngest had learned to ride a bike. The oldest had joined the school band. Life had continued in Kansas, waiting patiently for him to return to it. Eddie carried 3 letters from Mary now, each one more eager than the last, planning a wedding for September. Ray had already been offered his teaching position back in San Francisco. Holbrook had been accepted to graduate school at Columbia, wanted to write about the war, though he said it would take years to find the right words. And Jimmy? Jimmy had a scholarship waiting at Penn State, courtesy of the GI Bill, and a recommendation letter from Captain Pierce that he'd never asked for. Physics and engineering. A chance to study the mathematics of the world without applying them to killing. The night before they docked in New York Harbor, the 5 of them sat on the deck under stars that looked different than European stars, though Jimmy knew that was impossible. Stars were constant, unchanging, regardless of which hemisphere viewed them. "You think they'll remember any of this?" Eddie asked, gesturing vaguely at everything. The war, the fighting, the impossible things they'd done to survive. "Some of it," Holbrook said. "The big moments, the famous battles. But the small things, the clever tricks, the desperate innovations, those fade." "Good," Hawk said quietly. "Let them fade. Let the whole damn thing fade.
except the parts about coming home. But Jimmy knew it wouldn't fade. Not completely. He'd carry it forever. The weight of that first trigger pull, the mathematical precision of violence, the knowledge that sometimes survival meant being smarter than your enemy, faster than your luck should allow, and willing to try the impossible because the alternative was unthinkable. His father met him at the train station in Millbrook. Older now, grayer, but still standing straight. They shook hands, man to man, the same way they'd parted. Then his father pulled him close. "You did the math, son. You came home." Jimmy nodded against his father's shoulder, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. That night, in his childhood bedroom that seemed impossibly small after the vast spaces of war, Jimmy took out a piece of paper and a pencil. For the first time in 3 years, he worked out a calculation that had nothing to do with trajectories or armor penetration or the physics of death. He calculated the arc of a baseball, just a simple throw, the kind he'd done as a kid, the kind he might teach his own children someday. The mathematics were elegant, pure, purposeful only in their purposelessness. It was the most beautiful equation he'd ever solved.